The story begins in the United States in 1936, on a remote farm in Virginia. Otto and Helga Wunder, a German immigrant couple, live a simple life with their two children, Karl and Lizzie. Their life was peaceful until one day a letter arrived from Berlin. It was from a historian named Richard Word, who was researching the lineage of German families in America. He wanted to rent one of the rooms in the Wunder family home for some time. Helga was hesitant, but the down payment included in the letter was large enough to make them consider it. Besides, their children seemed enthusiastic about having a new guest. After some discussion, Otto and Helga finally agreed to take Richard in, and began preparing to welcome him. Over the next few days, Richard's belongings began to be delivered to their home little by little. While helping her parents tidy up, Lizzie accidentally dropped an old book. The cover is shabby and full of strange, creepy-looking illustrations, making her feel uncomfortable. A few days later, Richard finally arrived at the farm. At dinner with the Wunder family, he was surprised that Otto and Helga spoke English to their children. Otto explained that it was because Lizzie was in school and he himself was often traveling to the city on business. Although he disagreed, Richard smiled slightly and said, "Soon, the whole world will speak German."
Aber sie spricht auch Deutsch. Natürlich.
Otto didn't fully understand the meaning of the remark, but chose not to prolong the conversation. To change the mood, Richard started talking about the Vikings. He claimed that the Vikings had reached America long before Columbus and left behind various relics, including ancient inscribed stones called runestones. One of them was even found on the Wunder family farm. Otto was surprised that Richard knew about the stone. He then reveals that the stone is still in the barn, as it was used as part of the foundation of their house. The next day, Lizzie was seen sitting alone in the barn, her eyes puffy as if she had just cried. Suddenly, Richard appeared silently and asked permission to see the runestone that Otto had mentioned. Upon finding it, his gaze lit up with admiration. The ancient carvings on the surface of the stone seemed to awaken something in him, as if it held a mysterious attraction. When Richard looked around, he saw Lizzie sitting alone in the corner of the room, hugging her knees with a grim expression. Tears were still rolling down her cheeks. As Richard approached, he noticed the presence of a small bird lying stiffly on the floor. In a soft voice, Richard whispered something in a strange, unintelligible language. As the atmosphere grew more tense, suddenly something absurd happened. The lifeless bird's eyes slowly opened. The miracle that had just happened before her eyes seemed impossible. However, before Lizzie could feel any relief, Richard warned her in a serious tone. He explained that the resurrection was only temporary because the spell was not yet perfected. The power she possessed was still limited, and she needed more practice before she could truly defy death indefinitely. Slowly, Richard reached into his pocket and pulled out a dagger engraved with strange symbols. In a low, confident voice, he looked at Lizzie and said that there was something they should do together. Something that required a little sacrifice from her. What exactly was that man planning? Time moves on. In the modern era, a man named Evan appears as the main character in this story. He works as a medic and faces various emergency situations every day.
Get down!
However, despite his busy schedule, Evan also has to take care of his elderly father, Mr. Marshall. Their relationship is not harmonious, especially since his father still blames Evan for the disappearance of his brother Victor. Victor is a soldier who has been revered as a hero since his return from Iraq 2 years ago. However, shortly after his return, he mysteriously disappeared while fishing with Evan. The tragedy occurred in 2008, and to this day, Victor's fate remains an enigma.
Help me! Max! I can't find you!
To be sure, Evan survived, while his brother never returned. Since then, the family has never been the same. Today, Evan lives in a small trailer in his father's backyard, living out his days with a haunting sense of guilt. That night, he received a call from his nephew excitedly reminding him of the Halloween festivities. Evan had promised to drive them around, and despite his tired body, he tried to keep his promise. It was getting late when Evan returned to his trailer. Just then, the faint sound of a radio newscast announced that a rare lunar eclipse would occur tonight, a phenomenon that only occurs on rare, long cycles. Moments later, Evan suddenly woke up in a daze. In front of him, a man with a bushy beard covered his mouth, startling him. It took a few seconds for Evan to recognize the figure, and when he regained consciousness, he gasped. It was Victor, his brother, who had been missing for a long time. In a hoarse voice, Victor asked for Evan's help without giving much explanation. Without asking too many questions, Evan got ready. They needed a truck, a canoe, all available weapons, and enough food for 2 days of travel.
I need your help tonight. I need your help, no questions.
While Victor cleaned up, Evan gathered all the necessary equipment and contacted a colleague to look after his father while he was away. Once everything was ready, the two brothers set off on their journey. On the way, Victor finally reveals their destination, Tree Creek. Evan immediately questions whether this is some sort of revenge mission and whether there will be a shootout, but Victor remains silent, reluctant to answer the question. Upon arriving at their destination, Victor warns that this place is a point of no return. If Evan wanted to retreat, now was the time. However, when Evan saw the handcuff marks on his brother's wrists, he realized something shocking. Victor hadn't disappeared, but had been held captive all this time. Realizing the suffering his brother was going through, Evan didn't hesitate to continue the journey with him. Their next journey was by canoe, down a dark and silent river. On the way, they passed a young woman who was clinging to a poster looking for her missing husband. The woman's look of despair made Evan wonder, but Victor remained silent, focused on their goal. After crossing the water, Evan tried to open the conversation. He reminisced about the last time they were in this place and explained how he had been trying to find Victor all this time. However, Victor remained silent, not responding at all, just continuing to walk straight as if hypnotized by his destination. 2 hours passed until they finally arrived at Creek Valley.
Okay, keep it quiet. There's a dog.
Cautiously, they jumped over the fence that had a stern warning sign for anyone who dared to trespass. Evan was surprised to realize that this was the Wellner family farm. In the distance, they saw a group of people saying their goodbyes. Victor mentioned that the man they saw was the head of the family and that he wouldn't be back until nightfall. Evan was skeptical. He didn't think that they would attack a family. However, his doubts were dispelled when Victor showed him the deep scars on his back, undeniable traces of torture. Evan refocused and became determined to help his brother. At that moment, the atmosphere suddenly changed. The surrounding farm animals began to get restless. Horses whinnied in fear, as if sensing an invisible danger. Suddenly, a dog with fiery red eyes attacked Evan from the dark side. Without thinking, Victor sprang into action. With quick, practiced movements, he drew his knife and paralyzed the beast in one strike. After calming down, Evan immediately injected the rabies vaccine into his body to prevent possible infection. Realizing that the situation could not be allowed to drag on, the two brothers decided to split up in order to surround the house from two directions. From his hiding place, Evan observed a man coming out of the house. Shortly after, on the second floor, a girl appeared at the window and immediately noticed their presence. Her face turned frantic, and she immediately rushed over to warn them. On the other hand, Victor managed to get into the house and immediately pointed a gun at an old woman. However, the man who had been outside suddenly appeared from behind and managed to knock Victor back. The man tried to escape, but before he could go any further, Evan shot him down. Only then are their identities revealed. The old woman in the kitchen is Helga Waller, the now helpless young man is her son, and the girl upstairs is Lizzie. While Victor goes up to the second floor to confront Lizzie, Evan remains downstairs, keeping an eye on Helga. Outside, Helga's surviving son was trying to drag his body away across the courtyard, trying to save himself. Seeing the situation, Evan decided to go upstairs. There, he came face to face with Lizzie. For a moment, Evan was speechless, transfixed by the girl's beauty and her expression of innocence. Trying to calm things down, Evan asked Lizzie to hide and promised to try to talk to Victor to avoid bloodshed. However, to his surprise, Lizzie suddenly attacked with a sacred dagger. The girl then ran down the stairs as fast as she could. Unfortunately, once at the bottom, she was cornered by Victor and Evan. Despite the pressure, Lizzie still managed to find a way to escape. With agile movements, she passed them and rushed out of the house. At that moment, in the yard, her dying brother was still trying to crawl towards the shed. With a hoarse voice, he shouted to Lizzie to free something. Lizzie went straight for her brother's body, trying to grab something hidden under his clothes. However, before she could reach the key on her brother's body, Evan caught her. He dragged the girl back into the house, while Victor rushed to the warehouse to check what the dying man was referring to. As Victor searched all the rooms in the warehouse, he found nothing suspicious. However, his senses told him that there was something hidden around this place. He wandered around the fence until he found a black container that stood out amongst the rubble. As soon as he saw it, bad memories began to creep into his mind. With trembling hands, Victor slowly opened the container's door. Instantly, a weak wailing sound came from within, a sound so heart-wrenching, so painful. Although it was faint, the sound was terrifying, but it also sounded very familiar to Victor. Evan still doesn't fully understand the situation. His confusion was compounded when Helga and Lizzie started talking about something they referred to as the unparalleled threat. Helga calmly mentioned dinner time, warning that something would start to suspect if they were late. Meanwhile, Lizzie anxiously warned that Victor didn't realize what he had done. However, instead of offering any further explanation, Victor ordered Evan to tie up the two women. Afterward, Victor left to end the suffering of the man they found dying outside. At the same time, his eyes fell on the keychain Lizzie was carrying, a small object that seemed to have a hidden meaning. Although his body was still scarred from the previous fight, Evan tried to remain calm towards the captives. However, his surprise grew when he found an old photograph of two women, with the year 1940 written underneath. Meanwhile, in the neighboring town, Otto had arrived to trade his goods with the local shopkeeper. The shopkeeper was fascinated by the vehicle Otto was using, an old model that should have been an antique. However, thanks to Otto's painstaking care, the car remains in top condition. Back at the farm, things were getting tense. Victor suddenly panics when he sees Evan walking towards the black container and immediately tries to stop him. However, Evan is fed up with all the secrets being hidden. Determined, Evan opened the container door and was surprised to see someone inside, a bound, frail-looking man. After Evan untied him, the man introduced himself as Luke and revealed that he had been kidnapped in the forest about a week ago. Surprisingly, Luke confesses that his captors were the women Evan and Victor saw on their way to the farm. Despite feeling sympathy for Luke, Evan realized that he couldn't free the man with his bare hands.
You ever stop to think how this could have been you? Poor bastard loose! Take him in the house out of the way and take care of it!
He rushed to find a cutting tool. However, in the process, he begins to consider something bigger: revenge. Evan then entered the warehouse, where he found a large symbol carved into the wall. As he stared at it in confusion, Victor took advantage of his distraction. Quickly, he grabbed the key Luke had been holding and ran to a hidden underground door nearby, trying to open it in a hurry. Meanwhile, an increasingly curious Evan finally opened another door with a similar symbol. When the door opened, he found ropes and chains hanging from the ceiling, along with decomposing human body parts. At the same time, Otto finally returned to the container to free Luke. After managing to get him out, he brought the man into the house for protection. However, before they could feel safe, Victor immediately greeted Otto with gunfire. The bullets hit Otto's vehicle, making the man lose control of his truck. With quick movements, Victor pulled Otto out and pulled his gun. Otto was silent, reluctant to answer Victor's question. However, his expression changed strangely as his eyes fell on the figure lying lifeless in the courtyard: his son, Carl. As Lizzie had previously said, Otto realized that Victor didn't fully understand the situation he was in. In an urgent tone, Otto warned them to flee immediately before it was too late. However, the warning came too late. Suddenly, the basement door shattered into pieces. From within, a monstrous creature emerges. And when Victor tries to shoot it, the bullets have no effect. Realizing the great danger, Otto hurriedly pulled everyone into the house, locking the door behind them. Outside, the horses in the stable ran wild, panicked by the creature's presence. One of the horses that didn't manage to escape was immediately attacked by the creature, before reciting a spell in an unknown language. Inside the house, Otto finally revealed a terrible truth. The creature was once a man named Richard. He wasn't just a monster, he was someone who had been cursed. Otto also explains that the symbols engraved on the windows and doors are the only barriers that can hold Richard back. However, Richard realizes this. With his magic, he resurrected the dead horses, making them his servants. Once the horses were resurrected, they were immune to bullets. In a panic, Evan tried the only thing he could do, removing one of the undead horses with fire. The Waller family was now in a precarious situation. They rushed to close all the entrances, drawing rune symbols in every corner to strengthen their protection. Meanwhile, outside the house, Luke managed to escape and hide under the house. Richard, unaware of his existence, approaches Carl's body and repeats the same spell as before. Inside the house, Evan and Victor hear the tragic story revealed by Otto. Richard and his family had been deceived by the Nazis. He was sent to develop heretical practices, but only Lizzie had enough power to restrain him with runes. Since then, the 4 Waller family members had become Richard's guards and prisoners. However, their conversation was interrupted when a loud bang was heard. A living corpse broke into the house. Otto, unaware of the danger, walks towards it unsuspectingly. That's when the horrifying moment occurs, a sight that makes Helga and Lizzie scream in terror. Evan and Victor tried to lure the undead upstairs, but they didn't realize that they had left Helga and Lizzie bound. At that very moment, in another room, Richard was again muttering his spell. And then Otto revived. In a separate place, Evan found a sacred dagger that had previously fallen. However, at the same time, Otto suddenly appeared and immediately attacked him. Meanwhile, Victor acted brutally. He managed to finish off Carl mercilessly before turning to Otto. This time, the 2 undead were completely unable to revive. Their heads were smashed to pieces. The 2 brothers then went downstairs. There, they found a weakened Helga. Without caring about Victor, Evan made a quick decision. He had to quickly grab the bag containing the medicine that could save Helga, even if it meant running out of the house. Outside, Richard was riding around on a horse, looking for an opening to get into the house. Carefully, Evan tried to avoid the undead horses and finally managed to reach his bag. However, just then, Richard noticed his presence and gave chase. Evan ran with all his might, narrowly missing getting back into the house. Feeling frustrated, Richard finally cut off the electricity throughout the house. Instantly, the atmosphere became more tense. Inside the now pitch-black house, Victor continued to press Lizzie to give him the answers he needed. Finally, the girl shows him the scars on her back. That's when a terrible truth is revealed. Lizzie was Richard's first victim. Since the day the man arrived at their home, he had been sucking the life out of Lizzie bit by bit. Carl, who knew the secret, once tried to kill Richard. However, it was too late. Richard had gone beyond the limits of being human. There was no longer any way to defeat him. Despite beginning to understand the situation, Victor still couldn't accept the fact that the Waller family had kidnapped innocent people to feed the monster. However, Lizzie insisted that they had no other choice. It was the only way to contain Richard's rage and prevent a much bigger catastrophe. When Victor saw Richard walking towards the dungeon, he thought the witch had finally surrendered. However, Lizzie denied it. Richard was headed to Runestone. He would complete the dark ritual he had been preparing for. Since his arrival at the farm, Richard has been trying to complete a ritual that requires a large amount of blood. However, since the Waller family never provided him with enough sacrifices, the ritual had not been fully completed. According to one of Richard's old books, this ritual aims to evoke a divine figure from within the runestone. In the book, there is a picture of a man with 3 eyes. That is the final form of Richard's transformation, which can only occur during a lunar eclipse. In her increasingly weakened state, Helga reminded him of his only protection besides the runes. Richard brought his ancestral bones from Germany and used them to make a special kind of armor that he always wore whenever he performed rituals. Richard couldn't harm his own ancestors or descendants, so anyone wearing the armor would be safe from his attacks. However, there was one big problem: the armor was still in the warehouse, where Evan had previously found it. To distract Richard, Evan and Lizzie quickly threw all the magic books into the courtyard and set them on fire. The flames rose high, drawing the wizard's attention. While Richard was distracted, Victor ran as fast as he could towards the warehouse. However, his journey was not that easy. Just then, Luke, who had been hiding, suddenly appeared and tried to confront Richard. Unfortunately, Luke made a fatal mistake. Instead of weakening Richard, her actions enhanced the witch's ritual. Seeing the gravity of the situation, Lizzie hands Evan the gun and demands that he finish Luke off immediately. Richard cannot drink the blood of the dead. However, even though it was only a little, Luke's blood that was still flowing was enough to make Richard much stronger. Slowly, a terrible transformation began to occur on his body. Meanwhile, on the balcony, Evan finds Luke, who is now under the influence of magic. Inside the warehouse, a fight between Richard and Victor was inevitable. The witch used the same trick as before. But this time, he resurrected the dead dogs to attack Victor. Outside, the moon was almost completely covered in shadow. Victor was still busy fighting the demon dogs. While Richard saw an opening to attack him. However, Victor did not give up so easily. Quickly, he drew a rune symbol on his forehead. Then, he jumped onto a horse and rushed towards the house. His only goal to hand over Richard's ancestral bone to Evan. Unfortunately, when he almost reached the house, Victor was knocked down by Richard. At the same time, the flames from the burning books began to spread to the grass. Meanwhile, Evan and Lizzie work together to destroy the bones of the armor to set up the final trap. Evan asks Lizzie to perform a special ritual. She must make an incision in her back and apply bone powder to the wound, so that her blood mixes with ancient power. The moon was finally completely covered in darkness, as if disappearing from the sky. At that very moment, Richard began to shed his skin. The hole in his forehead widened further, until finally his third eye opened. To complete his transformation, there was still one last thing to do: drink more blood. However, before Richard could act, Lizzie rang a bell. Her loud voice echoed throughout the house, calling Richard to receive the final offering. Of course, it was a call she could not refuse. Moments later, Lizzie took refuge inside the house. From outside, the still-caged Luke kept trying to break down the door, trying to free himself from the magic that was overpowering him. However, Evan himself is now in grave danger. Richard finally makes his way to him, ready to drink his blood. However, something was not right. As soon as Richard started sucking Evan's blood, his body suddenly weakened. That's when he realized something: he had fallen into a trap. The bones of his ancestors that had been crushed actually contained a deadly poison for him. This opportunity was not wasted by Evan and Victor. Although Richard tried to regain his strength, it was too late. Together, they finished off the wizard once and for all. As Richard perished, all his spells vanished as well. Luke couldn't rise again, as his body was too rotten to be recognized. In the basement, Evan found Lizzie. However, the previously young woman had now turned very old. Moments later, she breathed her last.
Stay with me until it's over.
In addition, Evan discovered something much more important. Among the files, he spotted a map drawn on the wall. The map revealed a chilling fact: Richard was not the only witch. In the 1930s, the Nazis had dispatched 8 other witch families. Each had a connection to a single Viking runestone found in the United States. Realizing how dangerous this place is, Evan and Victor decide to burn Walker's house to the ground. After it's all over, they finally return to their families. The movie closes with a festive atmosphere. In a bar, people throw a party to celebrate the return of the husband. But is everything really over? Or is there another darkness waiting?